Well, we're doing the second half of chapter 7, the chapter on medicine today. And this one is really important because it includes a critique of Western biomedical training, which some of you are in. Now, it's different for people in the nursing and other professions in medicine than it is for doctors. This primarily focuses on doctors. It may be hard to hear some of this stuff, but it's important to hear. And I always kind of have this ambivalence about people, teaching people going into this profession, which is a wonderful profession. And I honor anyone who wants to work in it. But there are some real problems with the way it's done in the West, and particularly America. And you'll see that as we come up. So my ambivalence is, oh, so you learn this, what you're going to learn, and you've read it, I'm sure, in the text, and then you've got to go work in a system that it's very difficult to change. So at any rate, take what you can from it and use it how it works best for you. So let's start with the 3 theoretical approaches. And the one we're going to start with first is the ecological epidemiological approach, which looks at how natural factors interact with culture to create health problems, to cause and create health problems. So things like food distribution within a family. Who eats first? Who eats the prime food in a family? In many cultures, women eat last. They prepare all the food, then they serve the men and boy children, and then they eat whatever's left. And even nursing mothers, even pregnant mothers, that's happens in other cultures, some other cultures. So that food distribution within a family is important to look at. Sexual practices, hygiene, the degree of contact with outsiders is really important to look at. And so those are some of the aspects. And then they do research and data collection and quantitative analysis from an etic perspective, from an outsider's perspective. When you're doing quantitative analysis with data, you're looking at it as an outsider, not from inside the culture. So looking for findings for public health programs, for example, is one of the ways that this data is used. And so you can then provide groups that are at risk for specific problems, some examples, so that you can provide help and aid to groups that are at risk for specific problems. For examples, hookworm in China has to do with rice cultivation. And there's a very high rate of that. The urbanization and settled people in dense populations have more health problems than people who are still moving around a little bit. Cities are stressors. They can be major stressors, especially for people who maybe are newer to cities, from moving from an indigenous lifestyle, farming or pastoralism, into cities. And then there's historical trauma, which is intergenerational. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that historical trauma is passed down generationally. So that's the intergenerational transfer of emotional and psychological effects of, say, colonialism, of genocide, of slavery, etc. Okay. Now, the interpretive approach examines health systems as systems of meaning. So the interpretivist approach studies how people in different cultures label, describe, and experience illness, and how healing systems offer meaningful responses. So ritual, for example, as symbolic performances, it provides meaning to people who are suffering psychological support, and it provides psychological support to the afflicted. And the placebo effect is an example of that. It has a meaning effect. I'm sure you're familiar with placebo studies. People get great relief from placebos if they think they're going to work and or they trust the practitioner who gives them to them. In the US, depending on the health system, between 10 and 90% of the efficacy of medical prescriptions lies in the placebo effect. Now, isn't that amazing? Between 10 and 90% of the efficacy of prescriptions, depending on the prescription, depending on the illness, etc., lies in the effect that you have faith in your doctor and you have faith in the medicine that it's going to help. You believe it. Okay. Now we're going to look at critical medical anthropology. So what critical medical anthropology does is it focuses on how analyzing social structures, such as structural factors, rather, such as the global political economy, global media, social inequality, those types of things. How does it affect the prevailing health system, those issues, global political economy, global media, global inequality? So what types of afflictions do people have based on those macro systems, economy, media, politics? What are people's health status? And what kind of access to health care do people have? That's probably one of the very biggest issues. So critical medical anthropologists explore how Western biomedicine in and of itself creates an institution of medicine. And this is hard to hear, one of those things. It creates an institution that is in and of itself to the detriment of helping the poor and the powerless. It's built into the system, okay, that it's not going to help those folks very much, the poor and the powerless. One of the aspects, powerful aspects of Western biomedicine is what's called medicalization. It's the labeling of a particular issue or problem as medical. And if it's medical, then it requires medical treatment. And in fact, the issue may be economic or political, not medical, or it may not be a problem at all in reality, a medical problem at all in reality. I think we talked about menopause last week. There are just so many balding, incontinence. You know, those things are what happens to people. Erectile dysfunction as they age. They were never considered medical problems until they were labeled and a product was made or a prescription was made to supposedly alleviate them or fix them. However, you have to be able to afford the treatments for something that you don't really need a treatment for. That's medicalization. And B, when you listen to the litany of side effects when prescriptions are advertised, I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. So there's a lot of dysfunction in that concept of medicalization, where there's profit involved in naming something as a disease or an illness, and therefore here's something you need to take or do to make it better that costs money. That's medicalization. So let's take social inequality and poverty to look at this. By whatever measures and research, inequality and poverty are always in every society related to poor health outcomes. It doesn't matter if you're in the richest country on earth, ours, or you're in, sub-Saharan Africa. The poorer you are, and the more inequality there is, okay, it's those people on the bottom. There are always poor health outcomes for those people. So poverty is the primary cause in both rich countries and developing countries of morbidity, which is sickness, and mortality, which is death. It manifests in different ways, of course, depending on what country you're in. It's child malnutrition in Africa or India. It's street violence among the urban poor in wealthy countries. I would also say in wealthy countries like the US, it's food deserts, which we've been hearing so much about with COVID, where you can't get healthy food. It doesn't exist. There's no grocery stores in your community. Okay. The distinctions between most common health problems in industrialized countries and poor countries. Okay, now we're going to look at this. In rich countries, the top causes of death are circulatory diseases. This is the US. This is true of the US and other industrialized nations. Circulatory diseases in the US, particularly diabetes, malignant cancers, HIV/AIDS, excessive alcohol consumption, tobacco, etc., etc. They're lifestyle diseases for the most part. In poor countries, the three leading causes of death are tuberculosis, malaria, and HIV/AIDS. When you look at childhood malnutrition, for example, in the developing world, you'll see that as soon as, now this is the developing world, where there's widespread childhood malnutrition, so you want an increase in caloric intake, just the opposite of in America, right? In a rich country where the kids are getting too many calories. Okay, so we're looking at malnutrition in the developing world. As income increases, so does caloric intake. And so, therefore, increasing the income of the poor is the most direct way to improve child nutrition. Okay. Are feeding programs important? Yes. But the cause is poverty. So the best way to improve the situation for child malnutrition is to improve the economic base of the parents. Okay. That's the most direct way. So let's look at medicalization in developing countries. In Brazil, the poor often have symptoms of weakness, insomnia, and anxiety. Okay, so the doctor at the local clinic gives people pills for that. However, you know what was causing weakness, anxiety, and insomnia? It was actually hunger. Okay, then what they needed was food. They didn't need pills. So the medicalization of poverty serves the interests of pharmaceutical companies, not the poor. The disproportionate prevalence of type 2 diabetes among the poor in North America, also increasingly worldwide, but we have an epidemic of it, and we have an epidemic of child diabetes as well. It's among the poor in North America, and it's linked to poverty. And from a critical anthropology perspective, that is a form of structural violence. Okay. So poverty is a double bind. It contributes to chronic conditions. At the same time, it's contributing to the chronic conditions. It's limiting access to health care to people because we have a fee-for-service system. We have a for-profit medical system. On top of that, there are the transportation issues and distance to clinics and et cetera, et cetera. So this all has come to a very obvious consequences with the COVID epidemic. And the people who have the highest rates of mortality from it are these very people we're talking about. Poor people, people of color. And the people of color part, of course, goes with the poverty in a general sense in America. So let's look at the cultural critique of Western biomedical training. Since the I hope you read this. If you haven't, please do. As I said, I know this is not true for nursing education nearly as true, if at all, as it is for medical doctors. But you need to read it to understand what's going on. Even if you're not in the medical profession, it's crucial to know how to take your power in the medical system and why you may feel like you don't have any as well. So here it is, the cultural critique of Western biomedical training. Since the 1980s, people have been studying the training of people, particularly in America, of medical professionals, particularly in America, as a cultural system. That's a key point. The way we train medical professionals in America and other Western countries, but it's most extreme in America because it started here and got exported to other countries, is a cultural system. It's a belief system. So here are some of the ways it could be improved, our system. Reducing reliance on technology. Understanding health problems as they relate to structural issues, not just biological conditions. In other words, those issues of poverty, education, that type of thing. Diversifying healing through use of alternative methods. For example, massage, acupuncture, chiropractic. So those things are, to a greater and greater and greater extent over the years, being integrated into Western medicine. But it's still not common practice. And you still pretty much have to search it out. And you still may get pushback from your MD about utilizing those other modalities as well. So research on the training, the major studies one of the major studies that they did on training of medical professionals was about obstetric training. This is the reason I put up the two videos I did for this week, the fetus frightening room and the business of being born. And just listen to that title, the business of being born, and you kind of can get it. So shockingly, most OBs have never seen a natural birth. Well, if you've never seen a natural birth, how do you know what a natural birth is? What it would look like? That type of thing. So I just, when I first understood that they had never seen, most of them had never seen a natural birth, things started kind of falling into place for me about what was going on with obstetric practice in the United States. So medical students absorbed the technological, this is the research, they absorbed the technological model of birth as a core value of Western obstetrics. And that model, the technological model of birth, treats the body as a machine. So the doctor uses an assembly line approach in order to promote efficient production and quality control. But we're talking about a laboring mother and a baby here when we're talking about efficient production and quality control. The goal is the, quote, production of a healthy baby. The doctor is the technical expert in achieving this. The mother takes second place. You'll see that the fetus frightening room is the most perfect example and humorous, if it wasn't so true, example of that I've ever seen. And the birth involves very sophisticated machines. Now, I'm going to read you a couple of things out of the text in case you didn't get to it or haven't read them yet. So the first, one of the residents in the study explained, these are quotes, "We shave him, we prep him, we hook him up to the IV and administer sedation. We deliver the baby. It goes to the nursery and the mother goes to her room. There's no room for niceties around here. We just move them right on through. It's not hard to see it like an assembly line. The real goal, now this is the book talking, not the quote. The real goal is the production of a healthy baby. Okay, the doctor is a technical expert, I just said. One obstetrician said, this is quotes, "It is what we were all trained to always go after, the perfect baby. That's what we're trained to produce. The quality of the mother's experience, we rarely thought about that. Everything we did was to get the perfect baby." Another obstetrician said, "I'm totally dependent on fetal monitors because they're great. They free you to do a lot of other things. I couldn't sit over there with a woman in labor with my hand on her belly and be in here seeing 20 to 30 patients a day." Another commented, "Anybody in obstetrics who shares a human interest in patients is not respected. What is respected is interest in machines." Oh my gosh, I just, I'm going to tell you a story. I don't have much time. I intuitively knew that many years ago. And luckily, I had my first babies at a time when a lot of women in the counterculture intuitively knew that, and we had our babies at home. So I had my first two children at home, and the third one, which was, 10 years after the youngest child, I wound up at Bay Area Hospital because we had a midwife who didn't know what she was doing. And it was a very simple thing that was hanging up the birth. And so the baby was born just a few minutes after we got to the hospital. And after he was born, I left with the baby 45 minutes after he was born. And when I tell that story in class, many of the nursing students say to me, that wouldn't be allowed today. They would not allow you to take the baby. You could go, I guess, if you wanted, unless they could prove I was incompetent or something, but you couldn't take the baby. And that really stunned me as well. So I don't have time here to tell you about the difference between having a woman be in control of her own body in a birthing experience. I know Bay Area hospitals we're very different now. I know there is a birthing room. You can have a midwife. There are doulas now, and a variety of other things that provide support for women. And there's a way to combine, a hospital birth with having some connection and humanity, but which should be number one from my perspective. But another thing you might want to do if you're interested in this subject and you haven't watched Call the Midwife is that wonderful British series when, it wasn't that long ago. In the 50s, most babies were born at home in Britain because they had this wonderful midwife system. And, they had doctors and hospitals if you needed them on standby, but the vast majority of births do not require that kind of thing. So that's an interesting show to watch to just see what it was. You have to watch the early episodes because now they're further along in the time period when all of that is changing. But, the midwives would ride around on their bicycles, and they also did, prenatal exams and all of that at home and a variety of other things. It's very interesting to see. And in Germany and Scandinavia, the majority of births are by midwives, whether at home or in hospitals, and only docs are only called if there's a problem that has to be dealt with, and you can look up all of that on your own. So the question is, I guess, having read those kind of shocking sentences to you, quotes from the obstetricians, is how do medical students learn to accept the technological model? Well, first of all, there's physical hazing. It's a rite of passage. It's stress caused by lack of sleep. And it continues throughout medical school and beyond. And I've always thought this was the most counterintuitive thing. Would you want somebody, you know, just think about the ideal. Wouldn't you want someone well rested and cognitively all there to operate on you in an emergency, or whatever, work in the emergency room, rather than someone who's had 4 hours sleep or less and been working stressfully forever? And it's also not a good model of health. Ideally, you would think that people in the medical profession would be models of healthy lifestyles, and stress and no sleep is not a good thing for your mental or physical health. So that's the first one that gets them into accepting this technological model, is the physical hazing, which is a rite of passage for interns. The stress caused by lack of sleep, and it continues throughout medical school and beyond. The second is medical school training involves what's called cognitive retrogression. Oh my gosh. What that means is you have to relinquish critical thinking. You have to unlearn thoughtful ways of learning in order to get through medical school. So the first 2 years is mostly memorization of huge amounts of material. B, the bulk of the memorization forces students to adopt an uncritical approach. If you have to memorize huge amounts of material, you don't have time to go through and parse what it is you're learning and apply critical thinking to it, right? You don't have time to go, oh, wait a minute, does that make sense to me? I'm not sure. No, you just to get through school and to get a decent grade, you just have to do that. And third, or C, this mental overload forces students into a uniform pattern, resulting in what's the tunnel vision of what you have to do to get through. Third, there's a process of dehumanization that occurs, the objectification of the patient. We just heard about that with the obstetricians, right? And you'll see that in the fetus frightening room. What it does is, when you objectify the patient, it works to erase humanitarian ideals through the emphasis on technology. What was that last quote? Anybody in obstetrics who shows a human interest in patients is not respected. Okay. Now, that's referring to obstetrics, but this is through all medical school training. This is in common. Okay, so we're done with that. Let's go on to globalization and change. So HIV/AIDS is one example. There are other new epidemics, was SARS, H1N1, Corona. Corona was listed in your textbook when this textbook was written. This is a new, what we have now, COVID-19, as you all know, is a newer form of coronavirus, the newest, form of it. So those are some of the global issues that have happened in recent times. So there's no other aspect of Western culture except for the capitalist market system and the English language that has so permeated the world globally as Western biomedicine. Remember, I said it started here, and that's why it's so extreme here. It got exported to other industrialized nations. But it's not all one way, because increasingly there are cracks in the system where some medical people are using more non-medical healing modalities as well. Now let's look at, this is when it's interesting to read this now because of COVID-19, from what they were writing about in the text. So it's the heading of this section is New Infectious Diseases. So And what they're saying is that for a while, for quite a few years, drugs had reduced the threat from infectious diseases. But now, of course, we have disease-resistant infectious diseases, primarily from the overuse of antibiotics. You start putting it in the food supply, like animals that we eat, and a variety of other things, gets into the milk we drink from the animals we eat, and the meat, and just increasingly prescribing it, then we have now disease resistant to antibiotics for sure, and other drugs as well. So that's made the possibility of an epidemic or pandemic greater than in the more recent, more distant past, and increased world travel. How did this all get here? Not just this COVID, but HIV. They all came from people coming on an airplane from somewhere else. Okay, let's look at diseases of development. Diseases of development are health problems that are caused or increased by economic development projects, believe it or not. Economic development project sounds like this lovely thing that's going to improve the lives of people in poorer countries, etc. Well, it may and it may not. It all depends. And then you also have to pay attention to what unintended consequences of that development might be. So, for instance, dam construction and irrigation systems can dramatically increase cystomyosis, which is a disease caused by a parasite worm in the blood system. And over 200 million people have it. And there's always a steep increase, or generally, often, a steep increase in rates at large dam sites in developing countries. And that's because the dams slow the rate of moving water, and you get stagnant water, which is an ideal breeding ground for the worm. Remember, also mosquitoes and Zika in stagnant water. So what about increased obesity? Okay, that's a disease of development as well. So in developed countries already, we have rates of childhood obesity that are skyrocketing. And there's, that leads to health problems as an adult as well. So there's concern about child and adult health. We, the U.S., have the highest rates of any nation in the world of childhood of obesity and childhood obesity. The child obesity epidemic health implications, the causes, first and foremost, are, as you know, are not medical. And the steps to prevention are not medical. They're outside of the medical domain. They're changing diet and activity patterns, right? So that's a lot harder to change than taking a pill, unfortunately. It's a cultural change that has to happen. It's a cultural change that caused childhood diabetes. It's going to require a cultural change to undo that. Okay. So the next section addresses medical pluralism, looking at different medical systems, the presence of several separate health systems within a society, within the same society. So taking a little bit from here and a little bit from there, and making a treatment plan using different treatment modalities. So it increasingly is being used, and it provides patients with more choices about how they want to treat a disease. There's a lot of conflict and misunderstandings, as we talked about earlier in the chapter, between Western biomedicine and traditional practices. You're seeing this too, those of you who are reading The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, like getting Hmong parents who don't speak English to understand how to give drugs. So here's some examples. The simple miscommunications regarding prescriptions. Quote, taken with every meal. Well, the Western assumption, that means 3 times a day. That's not necessarily how people eat in every culture on earth. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So you've already got a problem. You got an example in the text, the Samoan example in the text was diabetes and death of a 16-year-old girl. The father was charged with her death due to medical neglect. Well, when they started digging through what really happened, the medical experts judged that it was cultural experiences were the basic problem. And then, in spite of all their attempts to communicate with the family, they were basically incapable of caring for Mary, the girl. And you're seeing this in Leah Lee right now in The Spirit Catches You. Language difference. Okay. The docs used the word sugar for diabetes. The mother thought that meant she needed more sugar. Okay. From the Samoan perspective, just as in Leah Lee, the family behaved logically and appropriately. They thought they were doing what was right. So there's issues there, huge. You can see why I'm having you read the book, and I think the Samoan example was perfect. Now, what is applied medical anthropology? It's the application of anthropological knowledge, like understanding where the Samoan family was coming from, understanding how to speak to them in their cultural milieu so that there's not this huge discrepancy in words that are used or time for things, you know. So it's the application of anthropological knowledge to further the goals of health. For example, one of the ways to do this is if you reduce lead poisoning among Mexican American children, you can reduce the disabilities that occur from lead poisoning. Okay. The way to do it is to get them out of homes that are painted with lead paint in apartments and tenements that are chipping and falling off. You have to keep peeling the onion to get back to the causes, because lead poisoning, until you actually do blood tests, manifests in many different ways in terms of cognitive disabilities and a variety of other things. So then you give somebody a treatment for cognitive disabilities when the real problem is lead poisoning. What about public health communications? You have to address local health beliefs and concerns. So you have to talk to the people, you have to ask the people, you have to have an emic within the culture approach to this. And part of the way that medical anthropologists do that is by adopting local styles of communication and not blaming the victim. You've seen a lot of that in The Spirit Catches You, right? Blaming the victim, blaming the family. That's what happened with the Samoan father, who was held in charge of murder due to medical neglect, when there was no communication. He simply didn't understand, nor did the family. So blaming the victim doesn't work. And then you become what's called a cultural broker. And a cultural broker is someone who is familiar with two cultures, can promote communication and understanding across them. So working together, Western biomedicine and a non-biomedical system. Since 1978, the World Health Organization has endorsed the incorporation of traditional medical healing practices into national health systems in countries. And the policy that they developed, and that's very forward thinking, that goes back to 1978. They developed that policy due to several factors. First, the increasing appreciation of the value of things like chiropractic and acupuncture and herbs and medicine people and healers and that type of thing. So in Ayurveda and Chinese medicine. So the first reason that the World Health Organization wants to incorporate natural healing practices with Western healing practices is that they had an increasing appreciation of the value of many non-Western healing practices. Second, there's a shortage of trained biomedical personnel. So why not utilize in some way by training traditional healers in some biomedical practices? Third, there's a growing awareness of the deficiencies of Western biomedicine in addressing the psychosocial context. And that's kind of what we've been talking about this whole chapter. Healing is more than medicine. Healing is more than a pill or a prescription. In fact, health is more than that. The psychosocial context is crucial. And some of us have a problem in our own culture with Western biomedicine, with getting respect, being able to communicate. What is it, like a couple of minutes? It's less than a minute, the research shows, that patients get to speak to a doctor before he starts talking to them and telling them what they need to know. I can't tell you how many times I've had to pull out my advanced graduate degree and say I'm a professor to get people to, in a medical situation, to listen to me and what I'm saying and not jump to conclusions about my, symptoms or whatever. That tends to work, but you've got to speak with a voice of authority. So these issues happen, the same complaints here about not addressing a psychosocial context and that type of thing occur within Western systems, as well as when Western systems are involved in other traditions of medicine. So intercultural health is an approach to health that seeks to reduce the gaps between local health systems and Western health systems to promote more effective treatment and prevention. So it helps fill the gap in much of what Western biomedicine neglects, which is a person's mind, soul, and social setting. All right, that's the chapter on medicine.